to tell you that the same event will be held next year on the 22nd of March, on the very date when Kalinouski was killed. This is our responsibility, just like it was our responsibility to warn about the developments in Russia, just like we warned about the developments in Georgia and Ukraine. It is now our duty and task to ensure that this regime ends and that our brothers and sisters in Belarus can take a free way to democracy. Thank you, and we are looking forward to Mr. Biegun. Maybe you can take a cup of coffee, and I would kindly ask you to come back to the last panel.
In the meantime, our panelists and those who are commenting our statement, Mr. Goncharenko, Mr. Karamurza, Gediminas Kirkilas, Emanuelis Inglis, Andrius Kubilius, just to take the seats on the panel. Karl Gershman is already waiting for us in Washington. I think he's already seeing us. Hi, Karl.
Zigis?
Oh, Daniel, nice to see you. It's been too long. How are you? Absolutely. We're still sharing the American relations and human rights. We are on the same panel.
It's very nice to see you. It's been a long time. So we're...
Yeah, they've done astronaut costumes too.
Okay.
Minister Fotiga, please also join us.
I think we'll be laughing around soon. Oh, that's Carl.
This. Okay. So it seems that all our online participants are already with us. So let me start because time is really, really precious. So this is the last panel of our conference, and together with my good friend Karl Gershman, I was so inspired by his initiative to collect about 500 signatures of different freedom fighters all over the world, and to say one important truth about the pandemic. This is not only about human lives or economies, this is also about democracies that are dying globally. Actually, we knew it from Freedom House reports that for the last 13 or 14 years, democracy is in global retreat, and we know it, of course, from the region. Ambition is dying, Europe whole and free is kind of stuck, and, well, just to provoke the panel, I would say it's because you do not listen to Lithuanians. I remember, together with late Kaczynski and President Adamkus, we've been fighting for membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine in Bucharest, and when you didn't listen, you know, bad things happened. Georgia was occupied. Then I still remember, together with Poland, we've been trying to explain it to our brothers and sisters in the West that this is the Munich of 21st century and Ukraine will be next. And actually it happened. And now, being kind of a litmus test of democracy in the region, we say this is time to embrace freedom and democracy in Belarus. This is time to support the people. This is time to say for dictator Lukashenko to step down and finally to have free and fair elections in this country. So that was a little provocation, and now I would really ask Karl Gershman to make an opening statement. Just a little introduction. I still remember when I met Karl in Washington and he said, Žygis, I'm fighting for Baltic states already from '83. I still remember that I was asking the Soviet delegation in New York to get the independence. And he's fighting from Reagan times. He's appointed by President Reagan to lead the National Endowment for Democracy. He's a real democracy legend on a global scale. So, Karl, please take your floor.
Thank you, Zigis. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Zigis? Well, thank you, Zigis. And our other Lithuanian friends for organizing this incredibly timely Kalinouski Forum on the struggle for democracy in Belarus. Since the public launch last June of a call to defend democracy, nothing anywhere in the world has done more to reverse the authoritarian upsurge during the global pandemic, which was the entire purpose of the call, than the extraordinary developments in Belarus. I'm sure that all of us are awestruck at the sheer display of people's power, of the courage of the Belarusian people to defend their right to freely elect their leaders, no matter how high the cost. The solidarity that poured out on the streets and towns, big and small, all over Belarus, has been a force to be reckoned with. People braved detentions, bullets, stun grenades, severe beatings, and torture in police custody and continue to come out on the streets day after day to peacefully declare that their voice will not be silenced. Not this time. This has been an extraordinary all-Belarusian pro-democracy movement. This historic moment belongs to the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Belarusians who became, in the wake of a stolen election, a united, civically awakened nation. It belongs to the hundreds of women dressed in white and holding flowers who formed the human chain in the streets of Minsk, Grodno, Gomel, Lida, and other places to silently protest police brutality. This moment also belongs to the thousands of workers who have risked their livelihoods by walking off their jobs. People from all walks of life and all professions, plant workers, metro employees, teachers, and doctors. They all have made it that much more difficult for Lukashenko to continue clinging to power. It belongs as well to the state employees, including the state media workers and law enforcement officers who resigned from their posts because they couldn't any longer carry out orders to lie and stand against their compatriots. It belongs to the soldiers who set down their shields at the demonstration at Independence Square, and to the riot police officer who also dropped his shield and joined the protesters, who in turn then embraced him. This moment especially belongs to the women of Belarus, in a country where politics have historically been dominated by men, where women are sometimes dismissively referred to as devushki, girls. The entire nation has become energized by 3 women, albeit thrust into politics abruptly and perhaps reluctantly after their husbands or partners were jailed or disqualified from competing in the presidential election. These women took on an authoritarian regime that hadn't budged in 26 years. Lukashenko has mocked them since they first joined forces under the now iconic motto, "We love, we can, we shall win," referring to them as those poor girls and weak women. But it was these women who inspired a nation to come together and who went on to become a symbol of the people's hope that change is possible. Events are still unfolding. There are still dozens of political prisoners who must be immediately released. There are cases of torture, beatings, and other mistreatment of people in custody that need to be investigated, and the culprits need to be punished. We must also reject the politically motivated criminal prosecution of pro-democracy activists, and I heard that just this morning 2 members of the coordinating council were arrested. They must be released. Not least, we must reaffirm the fundamental rights of freedom of expression and the freedom to be informed. The ongoing information blackouts in Belarus, including the denial of printing services to independent newspapers and the blocking of dozens of websites, must cease without delay. All of this is necessary for the healing of the nation. But one thing is for sure, even at this stage, Belarus already is a nation reborn. Lukashenko and his cronies simply cannot go back to business as usual after this Belarusian summer of solidarity. They thought that by unleashing terror, they would stop the protests, that fear would paralyze the people. But they were mistaken. They must now concede defeat and exit the stage. They must lead. There must be new elections, free and democratic. Kalinouski would be proud of the men, women, and youth of this movement, For Belarusians, the January 1863 uprising against Russia that he led is a symbol of their own struggle for national self-consciousness and self-determination. Belarusians have been engaged in this struggle for centuries, and under Lukashenko, they've had to fight this battle on two fronts, against Russia's ubiquitous propaganda and against their own state's choice to suppress Belarusian language, culture, and history. It has only been in the most recent years that Lukashenko, pressed by Russia's increasingly imperialistic ambitions and his own political instinct for survival, that he allowed a process of soft Belarusianization to gradually unfold, and this was to be his bane. Unwittingly, by allowing his people to openly speak their language, to wear their colors, to commemorate their history, and to study their culture, Lukashenko has unintentionally unleashed a process of national awakening that has now led to the rise of a new sovereign nation that has the right to determine its own future independent of geopolitical pressures and imperialistic ambitions. At the reburial last November in Vilnius of Kalinouski and 18 other rebels from the 1863 uprising, activists chanted the famous slogan, "For our freedom and yours, for our common future," the call to solidarity with neighbors across borders that was first used by Poles in 1831 in support of the Decembrist uprising in Russia. Today, the demonstrations in Minsk and other Belarusian cities are linked in solidarity to protest 9,000 kilometers away in Khabarovsk and other cities in the Russian far east, where protesters have proclaimed, "We have the same ideals." These unifying ideals are freedom and democracy, and respect for human dignity and the rule of law. It's not without significance as we commemorate Black Ribbon Day, the anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and we remember the unparalleled slaughter that it unleashed, that Belarus, the heart of the bloodlands during World War II, is today the epicenter of the global struggle for democracy. May the new birth of freedom in Belarus restore the hope of people everywhere that the struggle for democracy can overcome even the greatest obstacles, and that government of, by, and for the people is not about to perish from this earth. Thank you.
Inspiring, Karl. So let me present Secretary Biegun, if I have 2-3 minutes for those who don't know him. Well, he's one of the legions of Europe whole and free. I don't think that we would ever get to NATO if you and Dan Fried and others wouldn't actually help us do it. So thank you for this. Secretary Biegun has 3 decades of experience in government in executive and legislative branches, as well as private sector. He usually gets the most difficult, tough negotiating set. So I think it will help you to negotiate Belarus if, well, it's difficult to say to but whom actually you will negotiate, but we will see. Then he was born in Detroit, actually, where Lithuanian Americans are well present. Then he served in Moscow as resident director of International Republican Institute. As National Security Advisor to Senate Majority Leader, he provided Well, to be honest, if I would read it all, it's the whole story. So he's the man of 3 decades of experience in Senate, in White House, on the Hill. I'm really proud that you are here, and this is really means a lot. And I think with your visits to the region, we really hope that you will be able to get those who are still doubting, who are still siding with those regimes, who are not visionary enough to really help change the situation. Of course, this is for Belarus nation to do it, but we have to do everything, at least not to stay silent and not to side with dictators who were killing that freedom in this country for the last 26 years. So, Secretary, Deputy Secretary, please take the floor.
Is it on? Yes. Okay. Ambassador Pavilionis, thank you very much for that introduction. Professor Landsbergis, it's such an honor to be with you yet again over our many years of association. Ambassador Gilchrist, thank you for being here. And Seamus Member Zingras, thank you also for joining us. And to all of you, old friends, colleagues, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few remarks today. I'm honored to speak at today's session of the Kalinouski Forum. It's entitled A Call to Defend Democracy. The legendary freedom fighter, Konstantinas Kalinouski, inspired the support of people from across all parts of his society. And he served as their voice in defending their right to freedom and self-determination, just as we see his successors doing so today. These topics are a lifelong passion for me, so it's a privilege to join so many well-respected defenders of freedom and democracy during this two-day forum. The word democracy derives from the ancient Greek, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. By definition, in a democracy, power derives from the people. In the United States, the very first words of our Constitution are, "We the people," stating boldly that the people grant authority to the state and not the other way around. If we look across the globe, each nation's story of how it achieved self-determination is unique and reflects the particular moment in history when their democracy was born. And history has taught us that path to democratic governance is not linear. This was as true for the uprisings in Lithuania and Poland that Kalinouski joined in the middle of the 19th century as it is for the people of Belarus bravely marching in the streets today. In this sense, we could say that democracy is born from a yearning that we each have to live in free societies, to choose our leaders, to speak our opinions, to practice our faith, to own our property, to protect our privacy. It is also true that democracy is earned by the courage and sacrifice of peoples who brave violence and even make the ultimate sacrifice, as Kalinouski did, to demand and defend the right of freedom and self-determination. Even long-standing democracies like the United States continue to renew and evolve our own democracies. As President Reagan told the British Parliament in 1982, freedom is a fragile thing, and it is never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation. This process of constant renewal can sometimes be messy. The phrase, "we the people of the United States" in our Constitution is followed by "in order to form a more perfect union." Not a perfect union, but a better one. In the United States right now, we are having a robust public discourse as our country heads toward national elections in November. This discussion can at times be heated and even uncomfortable. But this does not indict our democracy. Rather, our democracy is strengthened by the resolve of our people, all of our people, to exercise the rights and liberties that all United States citizens are guaranteed by our Constitution. It is for this reason that the United States has been so inspired by the display of peaceful expression by the Belarusian people seeking to determine their own future. They remind us that democracy is worth fighting for. The United States stands by our long-term commitment to support Belarus's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the aspirations of the Belarusian people to choose their own leaders through free and fair elections without external intervention. As Secretary Pompeo said just this past week, the United States, as a matter of principle, supports free and fair elections that reflect the will of the Belarusian people. It is a principle enshrined in the Charter of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings. The August 9th election in Belarus did not meet that standard. We condemn the brutality that was directed at the people of Belarus in the aftermath, and we call for the release of all those arrested, and we urge the government of Belarus to accept the OSCE chair's offer to facilitate dialogue and engage all stakeholders. Just as we have since our founding, the United States stands with people exercising their right to form a government that reflects their will. A century and a half ago, from his prison cell, Konstantinos Kalinouski continued to speak to and for his countrymen through his letters from beneath the gallows. Shortly before being executed, he called on his countrymen to, quote, live out your lives in freedom and in joy. And in that time, when words must turn to actions, then stand up and fight for the truth. Kalinowski's words call out to us from the grave. Today, more than 150 years after his death, those words are no less powerful than when he first wrote them. May I echo his wish, especially for the people of Belarus and all freedom-seeking peoples around the world. May you live out the length of your days in freedom and joy. Thank you.
Okay, Deputy Secretary is leaving. We know that his schedule is tight, and sincerely thanks that you've been able to come for us. And good luck in your tough negotiations. Okay. Next stop is Moscow, I understand. Okay, so I think I can take it off when most important guests are out. So, Minister Fotyga, really Honorable Anna Fotyga, you are part of all our events and conferences here. And when I was listening to Deputy Secretary, and when I always feel, you know, your presence on Black Ribbon Day, for me there is, you know, kind of, maybe it's kind of expectation, maybe it's something that I really want. But I still remember the times that we've been working together, when Lithuania and Poland and Washington, D.C., it was like a well-oiled mechanism, when we've been dreaming together, you know, creating a lot of movements and good stuff in the region when freedom was on march. Do you really think that we might come back to this era of, you know, golden age of Lithuania and Poland leadership together with Americans trying to, you know, and other friends in the West trying to get things right again?
Thank you, Ziggy. Thank you, dear Ambassador Pavilianis. Ladies and gentlemen, well, yes, even politicians, oldish ones, may afford emotions from time to time. And surely staying here in Vilnius these days is full of symbolism and emotion. Moreover, I can feel the spirit of Kalinouski here. Also with my boss and of the late boss and authority, the late President Lech Kaczyński. When I speak about symbolism, it is 23rd of August, anniversary of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, or Hitler-Stalin, if you wish, and the darkest time for our region, yet we were able to overcome it. And state by state, nation by nation, we are able to achieve freedom. And these days, we are together to show our solidarity to people of Belarus. After all these years, after 26 years of autocratic rule of Alexander Lukashenko, protesting despite violence, despite years of intimidation, torture, preventing their real say in public life of their country. I'm absolutely sure that this peaceful revolution, sooner or later, despite calculation of all those who are still afraid in Belarus and outside, also in free world, despite their realpolitik and their fear of sovereign independent states around Russia. Belarus is also to join the family of free societies, free nations, able to pursue their own policy within their country, ruled by law and enjoying territorial integrity. Despite influence of players like Russian Federation and China, both of them, by the way, are not able to project real democracy to their neighborhood. And it is our role to show solidarity, to stand by people of Belarus. So much time was devoted today, yesterday evening and today, to indicate the peaceful role of brave women of Belarus. It was even called feminism. I would like to recall history, as this conference bears the name of Kalinouski. There were women of Poland, Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and earlier Grand Duchy of Lithuania, who during the time of uprisings, of January uprising, our common uprising against Tsarist regime, when their husbands were sent to Siberia, to prisons, or executed by the regime, they were taking over. They were not afraid, showing love for their husbands, their dear ones. They were able to not only to raise children and tend for their families, they were able to run manufacturing, or to run estates enjoying full. So it is part of this tradition of Kalinouski, of January uprising as well. This power of women is a noble one, full of dignity. And we see this. Those dresses, flowers, to marching against very rude, very violent regime, because it is afraid. It is afraid how to keep the Byzantine order. But these kind of regimes are already passé. This, whatever time it is to take, I'm absolutely sure. I speak from my own heart, but it is surely my own experience. Nobody was sure about possibility to crush communist regimes with the assistance of free world and their solidarity. We were able to do this, and in Belarus we'll see the same thing. And one remark, last remark, tomorrow I'll be honored to pass the award bearing the name of President President Lech Kaczynski to the previous president of Lithuania, Valdis Adamkus. They were excellent co-workers in supporting independence. Yes, it is an honor and privilege to do this, and let us remember the golden time of our cooperation. And I think that year by year, also under President Andrzej Duda and President Gitanas Nausėda, we are able to see more and more cooperation. And I'm absolutely sure that this cooperation brings excellent results also for our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, so much. And remember when we were marching yesterday with this actual flag in Gedimino Street, Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, you, Vladimir, I really felt the same spirit that I was feeling during those energy summits with Dick Cheney and other landings. So something is coming back, and I was really inspired by the Deputy Secretary's speech, because his lines are very close to us. And he said fear and just elections. That was said from Washington, D.C. I really hope that it will be repeated in all Western capitals, and we would really, in one transatlantic voice, would claim, would make this claim to the regime, to demand this. That was said today in this room, and this is a very important line. But we shouldn't forget the region all around. Together with us, we have another brave woman that is always fighting in Moldova, our favorite, Maya Sandu. Well, we are from the same EPP family, and I really wish her luck. But just to provoke a bit the discussion, to be honest, I was disappointed to see how official Moldova reacted to Belarusian events. If I'm not mistaken, let Maya Sandu correct me, it seems Moldova recognized those elections together with Armenia and president. Okay, this is the correction we need to get. But I was also a bit disappointed that, for example, my favorite Georgia was not so much reacting to those events, it just kept silent. I think if one of the lessons of Konstantin Kalinouski, this is for our freedom and yours. We fight for each other's freedom, we do not step down, and freedom is something that is not divisible. So Maya, are you with us? Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Hello. Please.
Good afternoon, and I'm very honored to speak again at this conference and to share our thoughts. A remark on your question. Indeed, President Dodon recognized the elections, the results of the elections in Belarus, but he doesn't represent the people, and we are going to prove that in a few months. So, and there is going to be an initiative, as I know, by the parliament, by some parliamentarians. We'll see whether there is going to be enough votes for this resolution. But let me start by appreciating or admiring the courage of the Belarusian people in their struggle for freedom and democracy. It's been really amazing and very encouraging. And what happens in Belarus now proves that the appeal for democracy is still strong in our region, and that for every setback in some of our countries, there is also progress for democracy, and this is encouraging. The rest of the countries, and especially I would speak about my country, are still facing challenges when it comes to having free and fair elections, when it comes to have sound democratic institutions. And I've been talking about Moldova's challenges over the last few years, while participating at the discussions in Vilnius. Things didn't go as well as we were planning last time I was there, but we have the elections ahead. In addition to the challenges that we have been facing over the last 3 decades, now there are some additional challenges which are determined by the COVID-19 infection. And there are 2 dimensions for these challenges, or for the influences. There are the domestic dimensions, and then there are the international dimensions. In terms of the domestic challenges that the pandemic poses, there are several important ones. First is that the economic crisis is affecting vulnerable people, and this makes them also vulnerable to the political bribing, because many more people become really poor, including because our governments, or in this case my government, is very poorly managing the situation, is not helping the economy, and is not helping people with little incomes. These people are actually more prone to bribing in the elections. So this is making our campaign much more difficult. Same is about the lack of free media, and because of the virus, it is going to be more difficult to have usual meetings with voters, because one cannot have many people in the same place to talk like in the past, to have a proper campaign. And this, of course, is an advantage to the political parties which have money, to the political parties which control the media, because then they can campaign on media, while we cannot have the same means, and then we cannot compensate through face-to-face meetings. This is also having implications on our door-to-door activities, same type of problems. And as I said, the biggest issue is the bribing of voters, because so many more people are becoming poor, at least in my country, because of the poor administration of the crisis. Of course, one can say that the crisis, the sanitary and the economic crisis, can lead to demand for better governance in theory, but we still have to see that. We do see a lot of people being unhappy about the current government, but then, of course, it's very difficult to make these people believe that there can be a better political class, that there can be a better government, because their experience hasn't been so good over the years. And this is one suggestion that I would like to make when we talk about Belarus. I think, and I hope the situation is going to get resolved, and the country will have the chance to have free and fair elections, and to elect the people that have the popular support and who would promote democracy and would lead to a free country. But they should also make sure, people of Belarus should make sure that they do not repeat our mistakes. Because in our case, for many years, many governments saying that they are democratic governments, and political parties saying that they are even pro-European political parties, have discredited democracy just because of corruption and bad governance. So once freedom is regained, it's extremely important to also focus on economic development, to make sure that this is inclusive economic development, to make sure that corruption doesn't spread and doesn't discredit democracy and freedom, as it has done to some extent. It has happened to some extent in my country. And now, unfortunately, there are many people who associate democracy with poverty, with corruption, with migration, and there are people who are actually looking for a tough hand to come and run the country. So this is just a small comment on the lessons learned by us. I think there are also implications of the crisis in terms of the international factors. For instance, when the COVID crisis just emerged, there was an impression of some egoistic attitude by some countries, by better off countries. And this, of course, should be analyzed because the poorer countries also need immediate support. The consequences for these countries are going to be long-lasting, unfortunately, and pretty bad. We do see that there is some deficit of attention for the democratic processes, for the elections in other countries. Of course, Belarus is in the center of attention, and it should be. But then there are other countries like mine where we have elections, and we feel that there is not that much attention because everybody has problems at home with the sanitary crisis, with the economic crisis. This is creating challenges for us because we are even questioning whether, we're wondering whether there is going to be international, there will be international observatory missions for the elections. And when you deal with a regime like the one we deal in Moldova, this is very important to have observers from abroad. Of course, it's difficult to convince some of them to come to a country like mine and observe the elections when they read the international statistics and they see that Moldova is among the worst in the ranking of COVID-affected countries by the number of sick people. But this is a concern to us, and we would like to find a solution together with our international partners. Of course, when you have such situations and the country is in a big crisis, one might think that the conditionalities would work better, the conditionalities by international organizations, by EU, and I mean here conditionalities on ensuring proper elections, on having free and fair elections, on respecting the democratic processes, of course, on strengthening the anti-corruption institutions, because everything's linked. For instance, today we're facing a big issue because the party in power is extracting money from the state institutions to finance illegally and non-transparently its election campaign, which of course puts us in a non-competitive or in a difficult campaigning situation. But so I was saying that in such crisis situation, one might try again the conditionalities by the donors to support the country to make sure that at least some of the necessary conditions are in place. But this is like the challenges as we see them, the additional challenges as we see them because of the sanitary and economic crisis posed by COVID-19. And of course, everything else stays almost the same. In Moldova, we have the presidential elections in October, and I should say that the situation is not as bad as it was during Plahotniuc's regime. At least now there is a little bit more courage in the society, and people are not that afraid to campaign openly and to criticize the government. But it is going to be a very difficult campaign, and there is going to be a lot of fake news, as always, from inside the country and also from outside the country. And there is going to be influence from abroad in trying to help some of the political parties. So we would need support, as always, from our international partners to have relatively decent, free and fair elections by the Moldovan standards, so that we could change the situation and get back to a status where Moldova will continue its way towards EU and towards EU democratic standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, so much. And well, I'm not diplomat anymore, and this is a privilege to be a politician. I really hope that you are still listening to what I say. I hope that you win elections, because honestly, and on personal note, and knowing what association agreement means, I don't think that statement, even if this is a president of Moldova, is compatible with our association policy, because if I remember well, in common foreign and security policy, we have to have united policy. I don't think that this is right. I don't think that this president has, has place in a European Moldova's history, and I really hope that you win. And if you want, we will come and lobby as much as we can. So now let's turn to my American friends. Michael Abramovich, well, I still remember a lot of meetings with you, Michael. I still remember lessons of humanity that you taught me in Holocaust Museum when you've been working there, and I appreciate it. But let me provoke you a bit. Well, from one side, really, we appreciate greatly what Freedom House does in Vilnius. Vytis Jurkonis, his democracy shelter program, this is something that is so important. But a lot of people are still criticizing Washington that they do not support freedom and democracy agenda in a way you should. In a way, we've all been so much inspired by America like an idea. So are things improving in Washington? From the speech of Deputy Secretary, to be honest, I'm inspired, but how do you feel? Can we put freedom and democracy really in the center of our foreign policy agenda, and especially into center of DC foreign policy agendas? Please, Michael.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Vytis, for that kind introduction. I still think very warmly of our trip we took together to Kupiskas several years ago, which was the place where my family originally came from. So I really appreciate your friendship and for including Freedom House here. And it's a true honor to be on this panel together with some dear friends. And I also did want to salute my friend and colleague Vitas, the head of our Vilnius office, for his amazing work on behalf of Freedom House and on behalf of democracy and freedom. As you know, we're in the middle of a political season in Washington, in America, and but the one thing that I find very inspiring is that we still have people across the political aisles in civil society, in the U.S. Congress, and as you saw today from Deputy Secretary Biegun, people who are deeply committed to democracy and human rights from Washington. And it's our goal at Freedom House to help keep the focus of U.S. foreign policy on human rights and democracy. That's been our goal from the beginning of our organization's founding more than some 80 years ago. So thank you for reminding us about that. I'd like to just, you asked in the initial prompt, Vitas, to talk a little bit about the issue of the pandemic and the kind of the impact of the pandemic on democracy. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to say a few words about that. But just to say, first of all, that we are deeply inspired at Freedom House by the events in Belarus, which show really once again that the natural desire of the human heart is for freedom and liberty wherever people live. It's always a mistake to say that people of certain countries are not interested in freedom or democracy, but when they are given the choice, they clearly want freedom, democracy, human rights. I think that the people of Belarus are showing us that right now. But as I was saying, even before the onset of the pandemic, we've been deeply concerned about the trajectory of freedom in the world. In March, just before the pandemic hit, Freedom in the World reported that 14 consecutive years of decline in political rights and civil liberties. And in general, not everywhere in the world, but we have found that authoritarians are getting stronger and democracies have been on their back heels. And these conditions have been sadly exacerbated by COVID-19, as many governments have used the pandemic to increase censorship, enhance surveillance, and disrupt elections with little regards for human rights or democratic standards. Let me just single out two particular concerns that we have at Freedom House. There are many, but I just think for the purposes of this conference, I'd like to focus on two. One is really the renewed assault on the free flow of information and the work of journalists. As you know, the work of journalists is absolutely vital to the well-functioning of a democracy. But you're seeing in many authoritarian settings, like China, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, you've seen the authorities censoring information, expelling journalists, revoking their credentials, bringing criminal and civil cases against journalists. We are deeply concerned about that. And even sadly, in democracies, you've seen journalists being harassed simply for doing their jobs and covering the protests. And sadly, that's happened in my country as well. We're not immune from that. So I think we really have to pay attention to the assault on journalists and on free expression. I think secondly, and then you're seeing this in Belarus, the elections everywhere have been impacted. Especially in repressive countries where elections are usually meaningless, you're seeing governments adding COVID-19 to their lists of pretexts for cracking down on the opposition. And I must, at this point, just say a word about Hong Kong, where authorities recently postponed the Legislative Council election set for this fall under the guise of COVID-19. And in reality, this decision is part of an ongoing wave of repression by the Chinese authorities aimed at snuffing out any hope for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. At Freedom House, we stand with the people of Hong Kong who are seeking to protect and defend the rights they were supposed to be guaranteed by law as part of the unique one-party, two-systems model established after Great Britain returned Hong Kong to China in 1997. Let me just say a word about Belarus and its relationship to the pandemic, because I think there's a connection. The pandemic has not spared Belarus from the challenges it has posed to other countries. And I think it's not surprising that for many months, the Belarusian government denied that COVID-19 posed a serious threat to the Belarusian people. And like other authoritarian governments, the authorities in Minsk, instead of responding to the needs of the people, they attempted to ignore the problem, fearing that taking real action to alleviate the health concerns would burden them with more of an impact than not taking action. So what we saw is the Belarusian authorities punishing people for wearing masks and medical professionals for speaking out about the urgent need to take public health measures. And outrageously, the Belarusian government, used the pretext of the pandemic for political ends and to avoid international election observers for the recent elections and to further restrict the ability of domestic observers to receive accreditation and deny them access to polling places on election day. And so Belarus really demonstrates the fallacy repeated so often by dictators around the world, that they alone are more able to address crisis situations than democracies. Nothing could be further from the truth. And for decades, Mr. Lukashenko has maintained power with the argument that he can deliver stability, essential living standards, and security. And for many years, the economic catastrophes and political crises and conflicts of Belarus's neighbors seem to support that argument. But fundamentally, authoritarian regimes are less able to anticipate and address the inevitable challenges facing them. And sooner or later, this weakness shockingly asserts itself, and as it is with COVID-19. And so for many Belarusians, the abject failure of the Lukashenko government to meet the challenges of the pandemic has demonstrated its inability to provide for the security of its people and for, and I think it was really a catalyst for the recent events, the very inspiring events that we have seen in recent years. Let me close with just 3 or 4 recommendations, both with the situation in Belarus, but also just more broadly for those friends of freedom. Specifically on Belarus, the brutality, beatings, rape, and torture that some of my colleagues on this panel have already identified, they really demand accountability. And the Lukashenko leadership, including law enforcement and corrupt elections officials, should be placed on targeted sanctions lists, either using existing mechanisms such as the Global Magnitsky Act or the Belarus Democracy Act, or the new ones currently being discussed by the EU. Second, we are very much supportive of the efforts of the OSCE to help mediate the crisis like this, which so clearly demonstrate the principle that the lack of democracy, the rule of law, and the protection of human rights are real security threats to the society as well as its neighbors. And the OSCE has multiple roles to play now, and it can use the chairmanship in office to convene negotiations for a political settlement. And also ODIHR can play a strong role in ensuring that the next presidential elections in Belarus will actually be free and fair. Let me also say that the situation in Belarus really shows that the struggles of a small country are relevant to us all. And it's really important for the friends of Belarus, including the US government and the EU, to maintain a principled position on supporting the Belarusian people, separate from geopolitical orientation, and to recognize that the challenges there arise organically from struggles lasting for decades that underscore the importance of upholding international human rights commitments. Finally, I would just say more generally, the issue that I just mentioned earlier, the global access to information, independent journalism, privacy protections, these are all important components of the fight against COVID-19. And democratic leaders, human rights experts, and public health professionals should be very mindful of some governments' propensity to misuse emergencies for political gain. And working together, we must clearly indicate when restrictions are not scientifically valid, and we must push back against excessive responses to the democratic situation. Now more than ever, people everywhere need democracy. They need democratic governance and respect for human rights. Humanity will recover from this pandemic eventually, but we need to act urgently to ensure that our democratic freedoms survive this crisis as well. And we need to ensure that we do not lose this opportunity to support the people of Belarus at this critical moment. So thank you again very much to my friends in Lithuania for convening this important conference. I'm deeply honored to be with you, and we're deeply inspired by the people of Belarus in their struggle for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was really inspiring, as Vytis Jurkonis told me 2 days ago, Žygis, he said, you know, if all the governments, including Lithuania, would really put freedom and democracy in the front of its foreign policy agenda, we would avoid a lot of problems, because now we react late, we react mild, but it's not what we can do if we do it preventively. So now we have Michael Carpenter, well, can I say the right hand of President Biden, maybe, at least a close friend of him. And I still remember, Michael, when he was working for Vice President Biden, I still remember the night when you've been calling me and saying, Žygis, Crimea is taken, Biden is coming with military planes just to assure that Lithuania would never be taken this way. I really appreciate that night and really the friendship we had in Washington, D.C., and despite the electoral campaign that you've been able to participate in this conference. Please, Michael.
Thank you so much, Žygis. And I really associate myself with the remarks that were just made by Mike Abramowitz and earlier as well by Carl. We really are today at a crossroads in the battle between democracy and dictatorship, really around the world, but especially on the European continent, and especially on the eastern edge of that continent, which is where the tectonic plates of liberal democracy and authoritarian oligarchy are clashing. They clashed in Georgia in 2008, they clashed in Ukraine in 2014, and they are clashing in Belarus today. Just as they clashed 31 years ago when the citizens of the Baltic states formed the Baltic Way, the chain of people across the region, demonstrating solidarity on two basic principles. One, awakened civic consciousness, a desire to throw off the chains of Soviet oppression and dictatorship, and two, a national awakening, an awakening of peoples who had been kept under neo-colonial control by the Soviet regime. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Belarus today. And it is really heartwarming to see this outpouring of both civic awakening and national awakening at the same time, crossing all social classes, from workers to intelligentsia to even members of the ruling nomenclatura, crossing the divide between East and West, crossing the divide between urban and rural, between the younger generation and the older generation. And that's why at this moment in time, it is so important to stand with Belarusian society as Western countries to set forth a number of very clear principles. And look, I really appreciate Deputy Secretary Biegun's speech, but he did not set forth clear principles on behalf of the United States government. Let me tell you what those principles ought to be. We, the United States, and our European allies need to be calling for new, free, and fair elections, period. We need to be calling for an end to terror and torture. We need to be calling for the release of all political prisoners. We need to be calling for an end to intimidation of journalists and repression of the free media, which must be allowed to report on events in Belarus without hindrance. And finally, we need to be calling for a transition of power away from the repressive Lukashenko regime towards a caretaker government that can ensure that there are standards in place so that the next election, the repeat presidential election, is truly free and fair. And if we don't clearly call for these sorts of actions, if we don't really take a moral stand and not engage in equivocation, then we will be doing a half-hearted service to the brave people who showed up over 100,000 strong in central Minsk yesterday. We will not be doing them a service. We will not be doing all that we can to support their cause at this time of struggle, where we saw Lukashenko, a dictator, swaggering around the presidential administration in body armor with a hunting rifle, but all alone, all by himself, with no supporters around. And that's why it's so important to stand with the protesters, to show them that they have our unequivocal support, and at the same time, to put maximum pressure on the regime, as Mike mentioned, using Global Magnitsky, using existing tools from the Belarus Freedom Act, to sanction narrowly the regime and those in the security services who are perpetrating acts of terror and violence. This is such an important moment. And, you know, you've named this conference Žygis after Konstantin Kalinouski, but, you know, I like to also think of one of the idols of Konstantin Kalinouski, and that was another famous son of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Tadeusz Kościuszko, who not only led the uprising of 1794 against Russian oppression and occupation of Poland as a proud citizen of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, but Kościuszko also fought in the American Revolutionary War because he saw the values that he stood for as being universal. They weren't just values that he espoused as a nobleman in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They were universal values. And he really was someone who not just talked the talk, but walked the walk. And I don't know how many people in the audience, I suspect many are familiar with this story, but Kościuszko, after befriending Thomas Jefferson during the Revolutionary period when he fought on the side of American forces in the Revolutionary War, after the war, he sat down with Thomas Jefferson and offered to buy his slaves in order to be able to emancipate them. And that was a step that at the time Jefferson himself was unwilling to take. But Tadeusz Kościuszko took that step, and it's indicative of the sort of moral bigness that we need to have, the sort of moral courage right now when facing this moment in Belarus, but also, to be perfectly honest with you, Žygis, facing the moment that we have at home, for example, here in the United States. I appreciate very much Deputy Secretary Biegun, all his remarks, but when we talk about the inalienable right of people to cast their votes, we have to remember right now in the United States, there is an effort afoot to defund and destroy the U.S. Postal Service, precisely so that American citizens do not have the ability, in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years, to cast their votes. We can't sit silently and pretend that this isn't happening. It is part of what Mike Abramowitz talked about. It is part of this global retrenchment of democratic norms across the world, not just in Belarus, not just in Moldova, not just in Azerbaijan, here in the United States as well. And so this is really a moment where we have to be courageous, we have to be strong, we have to speak truth to power, and we can't hold back. We have to be honest with ourselves about the principles we stand for, and as we enunciate those principles with regards to the solidarity we have with protesters in Belarus, we also have to walk the walk in each of our individual countries. Thank you, Zhigis.
Thank you so much, Mike. Well, I would just say something that one of the Belarusian dissidents told me. You know, Putin is using those months before American election to do his job in Belarus, and that's why we are all waiting for America to come back united, strong, because we need your leadership. We need European leadership as well. We cannot stay just regional neighboring states supporting it. So thank you so much, Mike. And now we have former member of Swedish Parliament, also member to OSCE delegation. Christian, are you with us?
Yes. You hear me?
Oh yes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me this great opportunity to, and the honor to participate in this important conference that is in a very crucial time. I would also like to thank the organizers because it's a great initiative to have this conference. And my full respect to our Lithuanian friends for the human chain you created yesterday in support of our friends in Belarus. I do believe that what we do and what we say actually have a great effect. What the outside world, the EU and the US and the West and the rest of the democratic world plays an important role and gives support to our friends. And the friends in Belarus. And Sweden have a long history of cooperating with the opposition, with civil society, and with human rights organizations in Belarus. I have myself had the opportunity to spend quite a lot of time in Belarus and also to observe numerous elections. And it's, of course, not always inspiring to see what is happening, but I think it's when we were in government, the moderate party and our foreign minister Carl Bildt, Belarus was high on the agenda, not only for our for national politics, but we were also striving to push EU forward to make sure that we got strict sanctions and great support for the opposition when that was needed. And it is now great, I think, to see what is happening in Belarus, because each election has been falsified. We have seen all the violence, the imprisonments, etc. after it, more or less each election in different, sometimes more, sometimes less. And we have seen people on the streets, but we haven't seen people in the streets as we do now. And this feels very inspiring, I think. It's to see ordinary people in huge masses go out in the streets, to see people striking from their jobs, to see people, journalists leaving the studios or telling the truth. I think it's a window of opportunity that we cannot miss. And when we see, and also if we take into account the COVID-19, I think there has been a mismanagement from the regime in Belarus also in this perspective. Maybe that has also been one of the factors that people are actually upset about the government as well. Because they probably don't believe as a president that daily vodka, sauna and driving tractor is the treatment of COVID-19. So maybe it has had another effect, but of course it has a huge impact for all of us when it comes to economy. I think it's a window of opportunity, and I think we have the possibility to act, and I think we need to act quickly and we need to act strongly. We need the EU sanction list, and I hope that the list of people who are from Belarus and who will not be allowed into EU, and I definitely hope that the US join us there as well, should be a long list. Of course, Lukashenko and his closest allies, but also on local level, and with a threat that if you misbehave, you will also be put on this list. that can at least scare some people. I think we also need economic sanctions directly directed towards specific branches. I do think that one of the more important businesses in Belarus is the oil and gas, and I think that should also be taken into account there. But I do think, as I said, that we need to act. We need to act strongly, and we need to act quick, both to take the chance we have, but also to show our friends that they do have support from the outside. Because, of course, the change has to come from the inside, from our friends in Belarus, from the opposition, and from the people. But we need to be very clear. We need to demand and call for free and fair elections, immediate and unconditional release of the political prisoners, stop the oppression and abuse of people. We need to ask for and demand free media and, of course, a new democratic electoral law. So let's not let the people of Belarus down. Let us help them to reach the freedom and the democracy that they so well deserve for the first time since dictator Lukashenko was elected 26 years ago. And if we work together, if we continue together, all those people interested in supporting Belarus, demanding our countries to do the same, I'm sure that we have the best option, or the closest situation to actually be able to reach this progress that we have ever had during the Lukashenko era. So once again, thank you very much for letting me speak here and for organizing this, because more of this, I think we can reach progress. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. I understand that we are all tired today, but I just ask you to keep this patience a bit. We have a reception at EHU University that is waiting for us. I really ask to stay, and then we go to that reception. But now we have a closing panelist, and then we have comments from Vladimir. Well, also, not to provoke you, you know, you saw so much in your important life and struggle, but we are kind of, you know, trying to solve pieces of puzzle. Now we discuss Belarus. You know, last year we discussed Ukraine and Georgia. Yeah, it's okay, but I remember Prime Minister Kubilius in the second Adamkus conference was trying to say, what about Russia? You know, why can't we deal with this, with the only reason of all our problems in any of those countries? And I don't think that in those 2 years, this call from Prime Minister Kubilius, and now Member of Parliament, resounded. Yeah, we are still divided on Russia. Do you see some progress that we are thinking, you know, how do we really support democracy and freedom in Russia, not only all around that are the victims of this simple fact that we do not have our own agenda on democracy in Russia, and we are falling victims of Russia's agendas in all those territories.
Much. Let me see. This is on now, right? Zhigis, thank you so much, and I want to, before I say anything else, extend my deepest gratitude to you and to your team. First of all, for putting together and hosting this conference, and secondly, for your invitation. This is my first real life with human people public event in 6 months. The last time it was a film screening I organized in Syktyvkar in the Republic of Komi in northern Russia. A place would be familiar to many in Lithuania because it was one of the capitals of the Gulag. But of course now, as in many other places in Russia, there's a new generation growing up with, you know, very civically aware, interested in current events, and very differently minded than the people who are in the Kremlin. So that was a good event, but that was 6 months ago, and after 6 months of working exclusively with computer screens and phones, it is amazing to be with real people, and especially so here in Vilnius among friends. So thank you so much, and a special thank you, Zhigis, to your team, and Luca and Anna Maria for going that extra 5 miles, because first of all, for organizing this event, but secondly, you know, Steve Biegun and I were not supposed to be here. Americans and Russians are not allowed to enter the European Union. So thank you to them for going those extra 5 miles, for making sure that there are exceptions made, and that we are both here today. I want to, and I know here I'm speaking not only for myself, but on behalf of many friends and colleagues in the Russian pro-democracy opposition, I want to express support and solidarity and admiration for the courageous citizens of Belarus who have been going out in unprecedented numbers despite the astounding brutality and force that Lukashenko's law enforcement, quote-unquote, bodies have unleashed on them. You know, last night when we had the opening session here just across the courtyard, President Landsbergis opened the conversation with expressing his bewilderment as to why so many people in the West keep talking about Lukashenko as the last dictator in Europe. And I have to say, you know, we in Russia get really irritated when people still say that phrase. It was a nice catchphrase. I get it as a former journalist. And it was true, I guess, in the late 90s when, you know, before Putin came to power in Russia. But, you know, I guess I'd advise people who say that to look at the map of Europe again, because there are two dictatorships in Europe. And those two last dictators of Europe, Lukashenko and Putin, have a lot in common with each other. There's a certain irony in this because it's known pretty well that they have very strong personal animosity. They hate each other, but that often happens with spiders in a box. But that aside, there is so much in common between their regimes that the late Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian opposition, referred to Putin's policies many times as the Lukashization of Russia. Because so much of what Putin did in our country, you know, shutting down independent media outlets, ejecting the opposition from parliament, rigging elections, beating up peaceful protesters, rounding up and arresting political prisoners. All of this was done first in Belarus and later on in Russia. And now, of course, also this list, there's a new point on that list, and that is the violation of the constitutional term limits on the presidency, which Lukashenko did back in 2004 and Putin did just last month in July. But apart from all of those commonalities, I think it's also very important that we, the citizens and civil societies of the two countries, cooperate from our side too. Our dictators have really learned to cooperate. I think that's perhaps the only thing that we can use as example for us. And so those similarities and those commonalities are the main reason that Putin's paying so much attention to what's happening on the streets of Belarus today. For him, the loss or the fall of Lukashenko's regime will mean not just another geopolitical setback, not just the loss of a reliable ally. For Putin, what's happening on the streets of Belarusian cities today is a nightmare because it's a glimpse for him into what may happen on the streets of Russian cities in 4 years' time in 2024, when our next presidential, quote-unquote, election is due again. There's that lack of 4 or 5 years between what Lukashenko did in Belarus and what Putin is doing in Russia. Our previous speakers talked about all the ways dictatorships and authoritarian regimes around the world have used this COVID pandemic to do their business. This pandemic has really been a gift to dictators all over the world. You know, the Chinese Communist Party abolished the autonomy of Hong Kong. There's been an escalation of politically motivated arrests in Turkey, in the Philippines, new emergency powers to the president, and so on and so forth. Of course, what's happening in Belarus, the main focus of this conference. But I think one of the most shameless power grabs that have happened during this pandemic has been what Putin did last month, in July of 2020. As you all know, on the 1st of July, he organized, in the midst of a pandemic, he organized a plebiscite on waiving presidential term limits in the Russian constitution. Not even abolishing presidential term limits, but waiving it personally for himself, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the perfect definition of usurpation of power. Words are interesting as well. Words are important. The word plebiscite has not been used in a long time. It's a historic term. It sent us back to the fascist dictatorships in Europe in the 1930s. You know, Hitler had plebiscites, Mussolini had plebiscites, Franco had plebiscites. Putin had a plebiscite, which really stood out even by the not very high standards of how elections have been conducted under Putin in the last 20 years. That exercise had nothing to do, forget about the OSCE Copenhagen document that sets out the standards for democratic elections. It had nothing to do even with Russian legislation on elections. There was no campaign, there were no set rules, there were no independent or international observers. There was a 1 week-long early voting in makeshift locations under the pretext of the pandemic, literally on park benches, car trunks, shopping trolleys all over the country, with no secrecy of the ballot, with no kind of oversight or control. Every night for that week, ballots were stored at the offices, in safes at the offices of the electoral commissions, again, with no possibility to check what was in those ballots and whether or not they were replaced or not. Of course, needless to say, the rallies by opponents of the constitutional change were banned by the authorities, of course, because it's dangerous during a pandemic. It's okay to herd millions of people to vote, that's fine, no problem, but that's dangerous for your health. To have an opposition rally, the websites by opponents of these amendments were blocked as well. Again, unlike the usual practice, opposition parties, media organizations and NGOs were not allowed to send observers. The only observers were those appointed by so-called public chambers, which are government-affiliated institutions. So in effect, a plebiscite organized by the government was monitored by the government itself. And as for international observers, again, in direct violation of Russia's membership in the Council of Europe and the OSCE, no international observation missions were invited, except some very carefully selected and handpicked far-right politicians from European Union countries. One of them, Stefan Keuter, a member of the German Bundestag from the far-right Alternative for Germany party, who is a known Nazi sympathizer, who sent around pictures of Adolf Hitler and justified Nazi forced euthanasia policies. This is all on public record. He was paraded on Russian state TV as a member of the German Bundestag, which unfortunately he is, saying how much better democracy under Putin is in Russia than it is under Angela Merkel in Germany. So once finally after this plebiscite was over, and by the way, 80% of the votes were gathered during that 1 week early voting, and only 20% on actual voting day itself, when there was at least some small control. There were 2 exit polls conducted in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which show that clear majorities voted against Putin's proposal. Of course, the official results were an overwhelming yes, just as they were all over the country. You know, Stalin's old principle that it doesn't matter how they vote, what matters is how we count. Unfortunately, that still is true in our country today. It's clear why Putin did this. He knows, as do people around him, that he could never have won a real referendum, an honest vote, with an ability to campaign, with independent observation. This much is clear from the trends in Russian public opinion in recent years. Karl Gershman, in his opening remarks, mentioned Khabarovsk. For 6 weeks now, the far eastern city of Khabarovsk has had unprecedented, for that part of Russia, street protests. Originally, they started over the Kremlin firing of a popular local governor, but very soon they turned national in terms of not geography, but in terms of their substance. They turned against Putin, they turned against the Kremlin. In the last 2 weeks, people in Khabarovsk have been carrying placards that say, "Žive Belarus." And by the way, yesterday we saw from photographs in Minsk, many people had posters, "Khabarovsk, my s тобой." So again, going back to that cooperation between our civil societies, not just our dictators as well. We saw what happened in the Moscow election last summer in 2019, when the strongest opposition candidates were removed ahead of time, as they usually are under Putin in Russia. And yet in half of the districts, pro-Kremlin candidates, pro-regime candidates, still lost out to literally nobody, to some technical spoilers who just happened to be on the ballot, because so many people in Russia by now are willing to vote, you know, for this glass, as long as it's not the candidate of Putin's party. And by the way, one of the people who helped drive that campaign to defeat those pro-Kremlin candidates was Alexei Navalny, who is now fighting for his life in intensive care after being poisoned 4 days ago. And we saw those trends even in public opinion polls. You know, it's difficult to speak about opinion polls in an authoritarian society when many people would be afraid to openly answer questions about their attitude to the regime. And just imagine you sit in your house, in your apartment somewhere in Irkutsk or in Vladivostok or in Moscow for that matter, and somebody knocks on your door, you know, a person you've never seen before, and comes in, and you know what's happening in the country. You know we have hundreds of political prisoners. You know those who oppose Putin's regime are denounced as traitors and foreign agents. You know that 5 years ago, the leader of the opposition, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down in front of the Kremlin in Moscow. And somebody comes into your house and say, "What do you think of Mr. Putin?" You know, what are you going to say? This is completely meaningless. But even in those conditions, there was a poll conducted by the Levada Center in the spring, precisely on the question of Putin's annulling of the constitutional term limits. And the result was astonishing, 48% against 47, evenly split, even with that fact that many people are afraid to say that they are against the government. Much more telling question, I think, or much more telling answer, was that a clear majority of Russians, 58%, that's according to the same Levada poll in the spring, 58% of Russians think that the presidency should be capped at 70 years of age. Putin's going to be 72 in 2024, everybody knows this. So this is sort of a safe, euphemistic way to say that you're against a dictator without mentioning his name. So for all of those reasons, Putin is worried. I think it's also important to say, you know, we heard a lot today the word legitimacy and legality with regard to Lukashenko's regime. What happened in Russia on the 1st of July was a game changer in many ways. But the most important way was that Putin has become illegitimate and his regime has become illegitimate, not just de facto, which it has been for a long time, but also de jure as well. You know, we all know that we haven't had free and democratic elections in Russia for a long time. We haven't had democratic checks and balances or institutions in Russia for a long time. Almost no free press, no independent parliament. We have all known this. But until now, Putin has tried to keep up the appearances and pretend to stick to the letter of the law, even as he violated the spirit of the law. So, he's been in power for 20 years now. He's the longest Russian or Kremlin leader since Joseph Stalin. But the way he achieved this was, quote-unquote, quasi-legal. I don't know if anybody still remembers the name Dmitry Medvedev, but, he was the president of the largest country in the world for 4 years. Technically, he had no power, but technically, because that's the way Putin used to go around the constitutional term limits. The first time, he put in a puppet in his place for 4 years. But again, he sort of stuck to the letter, right? He didn't violate the limit back then. We all know how elections were conducted. The latest one in 2018 that prolonged Putin's rule for another 6 years. There had been two major opposition leaders who planned to run against Putin in that election. One was Boris Nemtsov, the other was Alexei Navalny. Neither was on the ballot. Nemtsov because he was murdered 3 years before the vote, and Navalny because he was deliberately blocked from running through a politically motivated court decision that was, by the way, annulled by the European Court of Human Rights, but who cares about things like this? And again, so what was that election worth? The OSCE derided it as choice without any competition. That was their verdict. But again, on paper there was an election. What Putin did on the 1st of July is placing himself firmly in the same rogue league of dictators like Fujimori in Peru, Compaoré in Burkina Faso, Chavez in Venezuela, yes, Lukashenko in Belarus, who have used the same trick, simply violating constitutional term limits in a sham procedure that has nothing to do with a genuine democratic vote. And that is an important change. We heard very strong statements, for example, from the American leadership on the OSCE, the leaders of the US delegation, Senator Roger Wicker, a Republican, and Congressman Elsie Hastings, a Democrat, who said that we cannot deduce the will of the Russian people from this sham, and the result was the decision was made before the ballots were tallied. We heard Michael Link, member of the German Bundestag, who used to head the ODIHR, the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions of Human Rights, who knows a thing or two about elections, who said that this plebiscite was a complete farce. James Risch, the chairman of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that this sham vote removed the last vestiges of Putin's legitimacy. We heard very strong, very important statements. It's very important that those statements be actually reflected in policy. As we move closer to May 7th, 2024, just over 3.5 years from now, when Putin's current and final legal mandate ends. And if he decides to run again in violation of the term limit, he will become no less illegitimate than Chavez or Fujimori or Lukashenko. And it is important that the international community reflects that in very clear policy, in very clear statements of the kind that Prime Minister Kubilius and Petras Auštrevičius' colleagues in European Parliament passed a few weeks ago with regard to Belarus, with regard to what the European Union leaders said at the Emergency Council last week, or the Foreign Secretaries of Canada and the UK. It is important that that same policy, there shouldn't be a double standard. Lukashenko is illegitimate, Putin will be just as illegitimate after May 7th, 2024. The main movers, the people who will make that change, will be the people on the streets of Russia. In systems like Lukashenko's created in Belarus and like Putin's created in Russia, the only recourse for change is through the streets. We know how the ballots are organized. That's unfortunately not a way forward. The only change can come through the streets, and only Belarusians in Belarus and only Russians in Russia can and should make that change. But it's important that they can count on support and solidarity from the world community, because that will be the only policy that will be consistent with values and principles of the Western world. And finally, I want to say that, I'm a historian by my original education, so we've talked about many problems today. I want to take a step back and say that, overall, the trends have been pretty good in our part of the world, in our part of Europe. In the living memory of most people in this room, including myself, half of Europe was living under dictatorial or authoritarian regimes. Half. This includes your own country, this includes Minister Fotika's country. Today there are only 2 dictatorships left in Europe. So, it's not bad by historical standards. But I would contend that in the 21st century, even 2 dictatorships in Europe are too many. And I think that we in Russia, the democratic forces in civil society, our courageous friends in Belarus, and our friends and partners in the international community should work together to make as our goal, making Europe dictator-free in the foreseeable future. And I think, and I'm confident in fact, that working together we'll be able to achieve that goal fairly soon. Thank you so very much, and once again, I'm very grateful for this invitation.
Your last remark reminded me the last words of Mr. Palmer, who was a speechwriter of Reagan Westminster speech in my embassy. He raised a toast that world would one day be free from authoritarian system, and we would actually abolish it by international law. I actually like that idea, to be honest. But okay, this is a final discussion right now, and I would really like to invite all to participate. Of course, we have four speakers, four very experienced speakers, but I just have one question. Can we, we made the whole tour, from big Washington, and big guests from Washington just came to us. We heard Canada, we heard France, Germany, UK, NATO, UN, everyone who could say on Belarus was here, and he said something. Now we are back in family. And I have one goal, till next conference of Konstantin Kalinouski, that we decided to be on 22nd of March, the day of his killing. I want to achieve one goal, that we have free and fair elections in Belarus. How can we make it? Taking everything into account, we have elections in America. People are busy with each other. We hear something similar, what we like to hear, but we don't hear it. Last EU summit, honestly, I don't think that it was a big success, because I don't have this line on free and fair elections from all EU leaders. I don't have it from Ukrainian parliament, to be honest. I'm provoking you, sorry, Alexei. Do we have it in Polish parliament? Maybe, maybe not, but tell me. Just Foreign Affairs Committee, not a plenary. So something is wrong here. So how, because what I understand, we have the window closing. If we will not go in, through that window, if we will not use that chance, the democracy might be completely killed. We might go into some kind of military scenario, and people might be disappointed. So it is also our responsibility to support it. So how to make it happen before next, in next Kalinouski conference, we would discuss, Andrius Kubilius is a master of Marshall plans. So in next conference, we will discuss a Marshall Plan for Belarus. But, to open that page, we need to... Yeah. Okay, so I just provoked it, your discussion. So maybe, we can start with our guests from Kiev, and then two prime ministers and the leader and chairman of Parliamentary Forum for Democracy. And Minister Fotyga, please, join, and Ingrida, Petri, everyone who is still here. This is a final debate. So how do we make it in half a year?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to answer your question. I'm sure it will be. I'm sure next Kalinouski conference, next March, representatives of Free Belarus will be here. Not Free Belarus, but Free Belarus, because what we are looking for in Minsk, this is a kind of national renaissance, and it's one inspiring thing. I saw it in my own country during last 15 years, and it's really very inspiring to see how it is starting now in Belarus. But also I would like to thank Ambassador Pavilionis, you and all your wonderful team for great work, and all Lithuanian state, and really all Lithuanian state for this conference, because you showed leadership. What does it mean, leadership? To start do something which is important right now, which is not done by others. And you started this. This is the first big event about Belarus and situation in Belarus from the beginning of, from the August 9, from so-called presidential elections. And it's extremely important. That's why not only Europeans here, really, Deputy Secretary of the State, Mr. Biegun, is here, and it shows us great significance of what is going on here. It's the first discussion, and probably we will try to find what will be the main, mainstreams during the next months in situation around Belarus. Why it is so important? First of all, it's values. I'm afraid that often we forgot about values. We like to say about them. We work together with Emanuele Zingeris in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and exactly a year ago, Russian Federation came back to Parliamentary Assembly without any sanctions, and many people did it like this. We don't see anything, we say anything, we want business as usual. Is it about values? No. What is going now in Belarus? It is about values. Because if our values are human rights, democracy, rule of law, we can't just watch at how this mad dictator is killing his own people, and he is dictator. I think also the vocabulary is very important. And after this conference, I would like to ask media, all colleagues, not to call him president, no. Not to call him a so-called president or former president, no. We should call him dictator, because dictator is dictator. And the words, they really mean, and they're really important. So, dictator of Belarus, not Belarusia, because people are coming out. And what we saw yesterday, a mad person with rifle, with assault rifle in his hands, in his presidential palace and around it. So who is he? Borrell told and made a comparison with Maduro. So Lukashenko is acting like Lucaduro, and that's what he's doing. And we know the names of the dictators who were doing like this. It's Saddam Hussein, it's Gaddafi, it's Amin in Africa. So sorry, what is the line? And it's going on in the center of the Europe. 170 kilometers from Vilnius, from free capital of free European country. And that's amazing. It's something shocking us, and we need to react. So first of all, it's about values, and it's clear. But secondly, it's not only about values. It's also about our future. Today is Ukraine Independence Day, our national holiday. And yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much. It's really very important for all of us. And believe me, I would like to be now in Kiev, but I'm here. Why? Because it's so important. Because today we had in Kiev a march of veterans, dozens of thousands of people who were fighting and now are fighting for Ukraine in the eastern part of Ukraine against Russian Empire. They were marching in the center of Kiev, and certainly the first flag was Ukrainian flag. But what was the second flag today in Kiev? It was Belo-Chervono-Belый. It was flag of independent and democratic Belarus, like we believe in it. This flag was today, hundreds of them was in Kiev, like it was yesterday in Vilnius. Something amazing when thousands of people made this chain of solidarity. And today the same story was in Kiev. Why? Yes, Belarus people are very close to us. For centuries, together with Lithuanian people, Polish people, we lived in Kiev, Rus, then in Great Duchy of Lithuania, then in Rzeczpospolita. Yes, certainly. But not only because of this, but because we understand that today fight for Ukrainian independence is not only in the eastern part of Ukraine, but on the streets of Minsk, Mogilev, Grodno, Gomel, and other cities of Belarus. Why? Because this is the way to stop empire. This is a way to get rid of this really last dictator of Europe, like Vladimir told it. Like yesterday, Professor Landsbergis told it. Yes, Vladimir Putin is the last dictator of Europe. And today, Belarus is fighting not only for its own independence and democracy, but for independence and democracy of all of us. Like Jerzy Giedroyc told and said, there can't be independent Poland without independent Ukraine. I want to quote and to add, and it can't be independent Ukraine and Lithuania without independent and democratic Belarus and Poland. And this is all the same. You can look at the history. All our countries, two options only in history. First, all our countries were independent together. The second option, all our countries were occupied together. And we know it from the history. So that's what very important was going on in the streets of Minsk. So that's why we're here. That's why we understand what is going on. And that's why really Putin is so scared. Because when he's watching the video from Minsk, he's understanding that he is watching what will be in Moscow. And I believe in it absolutely. And that is what he's so afraid of. That is why there are so many threats to Belarus now. I don't believe in, but I don't believe in direct intervention of Putin to Belarus. Why? Because 6 years ago, the distance between Russian-Ukrainian border and distance between Russian-Belarus border to Minsk and Kiev is the same. Why Russian tanks did not start their move to Kiev? Because 500,000 people were staying on the streets of Kiev. It's impossible to go by tanks to millions of people. And after yesterday march in Minsk, with hundreds of thousands of people on the street, I don't believe in tanks coming from Russian border. But hybrid Anschluss is very possible. Trying to use Russian propagandists on Belarus state television, trying to use Russian agents in Belarus army and KGB, MVD, and so on. That is absolutely possible. And that is so important. What you asked us, your first question for this part of discussion was, what can we do? We need to press, first of all, our countries for the most possible reaction. You are right, I don't like the reaction of Ukraine for the moment. Now, we have a group for Democratic Belarus like you have, and I am head of this group. It's my honor to be. But we made a statement, we made a draft of law and so on. But it is not adopted for the moment. And I don't like it. I want firmer action. I think firmer action can be from all countries which were represented, including European Union, including yesterday interview of Mr. Borrell, which is for me a very worrying, because it was not straightforward enough. It was not strong enough, like we need strong enough reaction. So the first thing, we need to press our authorities, press our countries for the most possible pressure on Lukashenko's regime. And secondly, we need to press all of them for the most possible pressure on Putin. That's very important that Mr. Biegun is flying now from Vilnius to Moscow. I hope that this Kalinouski spirit will give him additional forces to fight there, because we all understand that biggest fight probably will be there. And that's the second thing we should do, and this will help all of us. And in the final of my comment, I just want to tell you, I see that next time in Kalinouski conference, I would like us to discuss the next thing. The formation of Baltic Black Sea Union of our countries, Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. All together, our countries, we have almost 100 million people population. It's absolutely comparable to Russian Federation already. In all sense, we are in this, but that's our answer. We should be united. We should be strong enough. We should have a special, you are NATO members, it's great. Ukraine should become a major non-NATO ally of the United States. We need to work on this. And when we will do this, it will be our basis for our independence and our democracy. I believe in this. I don't think there is another historical option. So, but we need not only just wait for it, but fight for it. Thank you very much.
Andrew, you belong for those doers, who does stuff. So how to make it happen, in half a year?